Fire, the unstoppable plasma that's heated homes and destroyed forests. Throughout history, fire has been one of the most versatile forces to ever be harnessed by man, so it's no surprise that it's got plenty of reputation in video games. Fire is one of the most common forms of attack in gaming history, dating all the way back to the NES era with games like Final Fantasy, The Legend of Zelda, and Super Mario Bros. The benefit of fire in these older games is that it's a simple way to visually illustrate a projectile to the player. Fire as a symbol is synonymous with danger. When someone sees it, they know to keep their distance and be careful. If a player is given an option to shoot a fireball at someone, they can be certain that they are going to do damage to that person. In single-player games, fire is one of the most consistent forms of damage that you can ask for. But in multiplayer games, however, this is very, very different. When the challenge shifts away from AI-controlled enemies and onto real people, suddenly there's an extra component that needs to be considered. Fire doesn't just have to be fun for the person using it, it also has to offer a fair challenge for the person fighting against it, both casually and competitively. This is the problem that has tortured developers for decades. How do you take fire, the most consuming, untenable natural force in our real world, and contain it, making it both fun and fair for the players who interact with it? Over the course of video game history, developers have been given the challenge to tame fire, and many different games would take their crack at controlling the uncontrollable. In the early eras of multiplayer gaming, especially shooters, fire wasn't nearly as ubiquitous as it is today. This is in part because detailed fire effects are often difficult to render appropriately, so the older hardware wasn't powerful enough to render detailed fire effects for very long. Early competitive shooters like Quake, Halo, and the original Call of Duty all avoided using fire weapons in their respective arsenals, opting for the less graphically intensive hitscan style weapons instead. But while fire was having a hard time catching in the shooter genre, it was beginning to spread quickly in other places. World of Warcraft was one of the first multiplayer games to significantly utilize fire as a potential weapon. In WoW, fire can be channeled by the mage class in the form of pyroblasts. These are powerful bursts of fire that are best at inhibiting large groups of enemies, whittling them down and preventing them from posing a threat. This trait, commonly known as crowd control, is what often defines fire as a weapon, and also what gives it such a negative reputation amongst so many. A large part of video game players absolutely despise crowd control. Whether it be Maze Ice in Overwatch or the stun gun in the finals, players absolutely hate it when their abilities and movement are restricted by something out of their control. It's a mechanic that directly inhibits fun for many players, as it takes away a core piece of what makes gaming so engaging: choice. When a player's choices are heavily limited or taken away, it instantly kills their momentum, putting them at a massive disadvantage against whoever stunned them before the fighting has ever started. Fighting against a good CC user can often feel like less of a fight and more like a bullet hell minigame, as any small mistake can get you instantly gunned down. The heavy punishment combined with the loss of control can make crowd control one of the most agonizing game mechanics to deal with. The use of fire as a crowd control mechanic is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it's one of the least intrusive CCs in gaming, typically only causing a slight alteration to movement and a damage over time effect when lighting someone on fire. However, on the other hand, fire often doesn't require the ability to aim, being able to be spread rapidly without a need for much precision. This can make fire feel like a brain-dead, skill-less mechanic that anyone can use, a trait that would be exemplified by its first major appearance in a shooter: Team Fortress 2. The Pyro is one of the 9 playable classes in TF2, and is the only class in the game to attack primarily using fire. He's incredibly well designed in terms of how he rewards the player for effective positioning and careful timing in order to flank and ambush the enemy team. His design allows him to be decently effective, but not so centralizing that he becomes overpowered. Looking at his design purely competitively, he's a very well constructed character. However, he can be very unbalanced when played at a low level, as his overall effectiveness ranges wildly when Team Fortress 2 is played not competitively, but casually. Among the TF2 community, Pyro is the most widely hated class in the entire game. He's often stereotyped as the no-thoughts, head-empty character, able to defeat entire teams by simply holding left-click and walking forward. Though this isn't accurate, it is correctly identifying an imbalance between how effective low-level Pyro can be compared to his class contemporaries, having far and away the lowest skill floor in the entire game. The design of his flamethrower means that he doesn't need to be precise, being able to hit anyone in front of him by giving his hand a simple muscle spasm. Out of all 9 classes, Pyro is the only class that doesn't need to aim to be effective, relying entirely on positioning to succeed with his primary weapon. Because of this, Pyro is often viewed as a crutch, a way for new, unskilled players to have a significant impact on the game without having to practice at all. This reputation isn't helped by how Pyro is arguably the best user of crowd control in the entire game, rivaled only by the 2 explosive classes. His flamethrower's fire does damage over time, with each tick of damage slightly altering each player's movement. In a movement-heavy game like TF2, that slight change can throw people off just enough to get them killed. Even worse than that is Pyro's Air Blast, an ability that can move players in any direction with just the push of a button, on top of reflecting projectiles back at people for extra damage. This focus on crowd control with an ambush playstyle can make Pyro incredibly annoying at best, and wildly destructive at worst. All of this means that dying to a Pyro can often feel overly punishing for the victim, especially if they are a new player. Though there's actually a lot of skill in learning how to position an ambush effectively as Pyro, that skill is invisible to someone who turns a corner and instantly gets burned to death. It just feels like they died, meaninglessly, with no indication of what they could have done differently. This is a key piece of what makes Pyro, and often fire as a whole, so frustrating. Fighting fire rarely feels like a fair fight. It's like the fire user is operating on different rules compared to everyone else. A common response me and my friends have when dying to fire is,
"What was I supposed to do?"
When getting killed by a bullet, the answer to this question is often just dodge better or have better aim. Basically just get good. That's the easy counterplay suggestion when you die to someone using a simple gun. But if you die to fire, it can feel like no amount of dodging or aiming would have saved you. Oftentimes, the best defense against fire is just to never let it touch you in the first place.
The best defense is no be there.
Because once the fire begins to spread, it's very easy for it to grow out of control. Team Fortress 2's Pyro represents the core of fire's identity in multiplayer gaming, as he embodies its biggest strengths and its biggest weaknesses. On the one hand, the design of fire promotes good high-risk, high-reward gameplay. Ideally, the fire user should have to trade the range of other weapons for the massive area of effect and crowd control that fire offers. Fire users may struggle to close the gap between them and the enemy, but once they do, the fire snowballs into burning an entire group of enemies. However, the issues with fire can start to rear their heads when it becomes too effective at achieving that snowball effect, resulting in an incredibly one-note and brain-dead playstyle comprised of 2 steps: set enemy on fire, and win. On top of that, developers also have to ensure that fire isn't so oppressive that it's unfun to fight against. Even if fire isn't a good weapon competitively, it still needs to be fun to use and defend against for the casual player. An example of where this can go wrong is through Ness in Smash Bros. In basically every game in the series, Ness is a high mid-tier at best, usually being in the lower half of the cast as far as competitive viability goes. However, in a casual setting, the ability for low-level players to spam his side special, PK Fire, to constantly burn enemies is incredibly annoying. An effective implementation of fire needs to be competitively viable and casually fun to use and defend against, such as Mario's Fireball, Lucas's PK Fire, or Charizard's Fire Breath from the same series. This is the challenge of fire. How do you control its flame without putting it out completely? Team Fortress 2 has been one of the most prolific and influential games of all time, affecting hundreds of developers in how they perceive multiplayer game design. This influence has caused the use of pyro-like weapons and characters to spread rapidly, resulting in many games that attempt to recreate the pyro's rewarding class design in their own games. Specifically, I think that there are 2 different games that offer really interesting interpretations of how a fire-based attacker can be both fun and balanced. Firstly, we have the Driller from Deep Rock Galactic, a class that takes the pyro's design and alters it to fit a PvE environment as opposed to a PvP one. The Driller's main niche in the gameplay of DRG is that he's able to affect the environment around him more than any other character. His drills and explosives all allow him to take full advantage of the destructible environments that comprise Hoxie's 4, making tunnels and traps to benefit his fellow miners. To assist this, his default primary is his trusty Flamethrower, which allows him to handle large swarms of Glyphids fairly easily. Whereas Pyro is something of a crowd control ambush hybrid, the Driller's Flamethrower is primarily geared towards crowd control exclusively. It's often very helpful for the driller to lure a swarm away from his teammates, as he can use his explosives and flamethrower to deal with clusters of enemies much more effectively than the other classes. But these benefits don't come without the requisite downsides. The driller's biggest weakness is that he's awful against single targets, doing pitiful damage when he isn't able to utilize his CC abilities to their max potential. This downside is what makes the driller balanced, but it isn't so punishing that it takes away from him being fun. A good driller can always find a way to mold the terrain around a situation in order to help out his fellow dwarves. This design philosophy is what makes the driller, and DRG's classes in general, so remarkable. Even when the situation is stacked against him, the driller can always find a way to use his tools to assist his teammates.
Rock and stone!
The second fire user I want to discuss is the heavy class from the finals. While the heavy isn't modeled around the use of fire exclusively, he has 3 weapons that all utilize fire in a very interesting way. First off, the heavy is given his own respective flamethrower, which functions similarly to the other ones we've discussed thus far. It burns large groups of enemies, sets them on fire, does damage over time, and is incredibly good as an ambush tool when attacking from around corners or in high places. At a glance, it might seem like a copy-pasted version of TF2's flamethrower, even having a similar physical design and the same weakness against open areas and quick attacks. However, a very intriguing quality that this flamethrower has is its relationship with one of the most annoying weapons in the finals: gas. Gas is obnoxious. It does a large amount of damage very quickly, and can be used to completely lock down an objective from every angle. It can be thrown as a grenade, placed as a landmine, or tossed as a canister, but in every form, it is, in every sense of the word, obnoxious. Luckily, the developers realized this and gave it a single counter in the form of fire. If fire ever touches gas, it causes a chemical reaction that results in the gas dissipating from the air. While there are other ways of placing fire, such as the flammable barrels placed throughout each map, these methods are often sloppy and can result in creating more chaos around the objective as opposed to making a steal easier. The flamethrower is the only weapon in the game that's able to clear out gas without any risk of self-damage, making it the hard counter to gas-based defenses. This is huge for clutching out steals under pressure, as oftentimes a glass mine placed on the cash-out station can be the difference between losing and winning. This trait of the flamethrower gives it an added supportive capability in the way it uses fire, causing it to stand out amongst the other fire users, which are almost strictly offensive in nature. The 2 other weapons the Heavy can use are his incendiary grenade and its landmine counterpart. These are extra weapons the Heavy can equip to maximize his fire-based output, with the grenade providing excellent defensive crowd control and area denial, while the landmine makes a great defensive tool when placed on an objective. The combination of these 3 weapons results in a playstyle that uses fire as something of a Swiss Army knife, able to act offensively, defensively, and supportively. And yet, the finals doesn't make fire too good to the point that it's unfun to play against. Because fire has to attach to something in order to exist, and the majority of the finals arenas are destructible, there are many ways for players to alter the battlefield in order to avoid fire. And oftentimes there will be so much fire that it won't necessarily benefit the group that deploys it. If teams aren't careful, the fire they think they have control over will quickly start to hurt more than it helps. And if fire is left unkempt for too long, it'll grow into a problem greater than anyone is capable of fighting. And at that point, all one can simply do is walk away. In nearly every appearance fire makes in video games, it's given the exact same weakness. If the player stays away from the fire, it can't burn them. That may sound silly to you. Obviously, if you're not close to the danger won't hurt you. But with fire, even if you know where it is, there's always a very limited range in which it can act. And if you're simply away from its effective range, or standing near water, there's very little the fire can do to hurt you. There's a reason why many fire-based characters are often seen as noob traps. Characters that are meant to seem really good to casual players, but actually aren't all that good in the grand scheme of things. Because once you get close enough to burn someone with fire, it feels like you're wielding an unstoppable force capable of destroying cities. Inexperienced players will attempt to contend the fire in its own range, only to find out that its close range impact is simply unmatched. But once the opposing player grows up a little, they'll learn that the only thing they have to do to beat the fire is to keep it at a distance. Weirdly enough, the way fire burns its victims is often the way people can be burned in real life. In our day-to-day lives, it's easy to feel like certain things are just out of your control. You have a falling out with a friend and they drift away. Your partner breaks up with you and you're alone again. you lose your job and are left to find employment. Sometimes the fires of life can grow to the point that they become insurmountable. For many, the response to seeing this might be to try and salvage what's within the fire, to run back into the situation and attempt to fix it and make it back to normal. But once the fire burns you enough, you'll begin to realize that it's become too big to ever be salvaged, and the inexperienced person learns that the fire can't be fought. It's just too powerful when it's in its element. So the best thing to do is to just walk away, to let it go, to find somewhere safer where the fire can't burn you anymore. The burns might have left scars and bruises, but it will be all worth it when it's over, because the next time you encounter a fire, you'll learn to simply let it be.